Comrades, the North and South divide comprises of the countries in the northern hemisphere and those in the south. The North is developed, it is rich, it has got high technology, advanced technology, and high standards of living. We in the South are largely developing. We suffer poverty, disease, exploding populations, and we have deficiencies in social services and infrastructure. Yet we are resource rich. The North has exploited human and material resources of the South in the past 700 years. Of course, through slave trade and colonialism are now presently other forms of neocolonialism. 88% of the global population lives in the South. But there are also disparities in the South. And in particular, Africa, which is the most populous continent after Asia, is more disadvantaged than Latin America, Caribbean, and Asia. And I want to discuss parliamentary diplomacy in the context of Africa. I want to give that African perspective. Now, Africa must use parliamentary diplomacy as a tool to counter deficiencies and challenges to trade and economic cooperation. The focus must be on the following three interventions. The first focus is that we must use parliamentary diplomacy to promote discourse and building consensus on a paradigm shift and a new agenda on African trade and economic cooperation. A paradigm shift to a new transformative agenda that advances trade and economic cooperation. A new trade and economic agenda that is proactive, not reactionary. A new agenda that moves past colonial lamentation. Colonials left Africa 70 years ago, but we still lament about colonialism. An agenda that promotes economic and trade interests for Africa. A pan-African trade and economic agenda. We should stop in Africa being pro-America, pro-Russia, pro-China, pro-EU, pro-NATO. We must be pro-ourselves. The Chinese have done it. They have set their own trade and economic agenda, and they are executing it regardless. We must gather courage to implement a paradigm shift, starting with the reform of the African Union Trade and Industrial Commission, to be more responsive and proactive in removing all barriers to trade and economic cooperation that keep our continent in underdevelopment. The second intervention is we must use parliamentary democracy to promote discourse and legislation. We must use parliamentary democracy to promote discourse and legislation on agreements that remove barriers to intra-African trade. Intra-African trade accounts for only 16% of the total African trade volume. If you contrast this with Europe and Asia, you find that intra-European trade stands at 70% of the total European Union trade. And the intra-Asia trade stands at 60% of the total Asia trade. Now, Africa trades more with China and Europe than with itself. 84% of the total African volume trade is external. More African dollars go to Europe and China than to Africa. We can look at 3 commodities, for instance. Let's look at 3 commodities. Wheat, rice, and maize. Some of you call it corn. For wheat, Ethiopia, South Africa, Zambia are the biggest producers of wheat. Algeria and Morocco are the biggest importers. But where do they import from? They import from Russia and Ukraine. Let's look at corn. Nigeria is the biggest importer of corn. South Africa is the biggest producer of corn. Where does Nigeria buy its corn? From Argentina, China, and Brazil. Where does South Africa sell its corn? Japan and South Korea. Let's look at rice. Ivory Coast is the biggest importer of rice. Where do they import? From China and India. And Nigeria, its neighbor, is the biggest producer. Now, we must promote this course that supports economic integration and intra-African trade. Third, and this is one of the last, we must use parliamentary diplomacy, to negotiate foreign direct investments or appropriate funds for strategic investments in infrastructure. We need to promote investments in transport and communication infrastructure to promote our own interconnectivity. For instance, the cost of calling, if I am in East Africa and I want to call somebody in Morocco, the cost of that call is going to be higher than the cost if I am in East Africa and I want to call China or America. We need to invest in roads, air, sea interconnectivity. I want to give you this example. I came from East Africa, Entebbe. I couldn't fly direct to Morocco. I had to go to Istanbul. And then from Istanbul, I came to Morocco. When I'm going back, I don't fly direct back to Entebbe. I will fly to Doha, and then I go to Entebbe. I think that is an interconnectivity deficiency that we need to resolve in Africa. Transport and communication infrastructure devoid